Okay, the Cold War. We've all heard the name, right? It's this huge conflict that basically defined half a century. But what if I told you there isn't just one story of the Cold War? In this explainer, we're going to dig into three totally different ways historians look at this era. And this matters because how we see the past, well, it changes everything about how we see the present. All right, so first things first, let's get on the same page. Here's the textbook definition, the one we probably all learned in school. The Cold War, right? It's that long period of geopolitical tension between the United States and the Soviet Union. And it ran from the end of World War II all the way to the early 90s. It was this huge global rivalry, but, and this is key, they never actually fought a direct, hot war against each other. Thank goodness for that. Sounds pretty straightforward, doesn't it? But, that simple definition just completely glosses over the really juicy questions, like, who's to blame? Who really started it all? And maybe the biggest question of all, was it really just a conflict, or was there something else going on? And that question leads us right into our first lens for looking at this whole thing. This is probably the version you know best. It's the one you see in movies, right? The Cold War as this epic, grand, ideological struggle. Capitalism versus communism, good versus evil, a fight for the very soul of the world. But here's where it gets interesting. Even inside this one idea, there's this massive debate. You've got two main camps. First, there's the orthodox view. This is the classic Western story. The Soviet Union, driven by this aggressive, expansionist communism, was the bad guy. The US, it was just playing defense, trying to contain the threat. But then you have the revisionist view, and it just flips that whole story on its head. It argues that, hey, wait a minute. The US was the big dog after 1945. It was the one trying to mold the world to fit its own economic needs. And from that perspective, what the Soviets were doing looks a lot less like aggression and more like a desperate scramble to build a defensive wall around themselves. And if you want to understand that revisionist argument, really feel it, just look at this number, 27 million. That is how many people the Soviet Union lost in World War II. Just to put that into perspective, the United States lost around 400,000. When you think about that staggering, almost unthinkable loss, suddenly the Soviet desire for a security zone doesn't sound so aggressive, does it? It sounds a lot more like a desperate move from a country terrified of ever being invaded again. So, okay, we've got this intense blame game. Was it their fault? Was it our fault? But what if we're asking the wrong question entirely? What if this massive global conflict, the one that brought us to the very edge of nuclear annihilation, wasn't just some horrible accident? What if it was actually useful? And that wild idea brings us to our second lens. Now, this one's a bit more cynical for sure, but it is absolutely fascinating. It's the idea of the Cold War as a mutually useful conflict. The theory here is that this incredibly dangerous standoff wasn't just a problem. It was also a solution that gave both superpowers some pretty surprising benefits. Useful? How could a near apocalypse be useful? Well, stick with me here. This perspective argues it solved some big geopolitical headaches. For example, it settled the German problem by neatly dividing Europe into two stable camps. It also kept a really strict pecking order when it came to nuclear weapons. But the real benefits were at home. For the United States, it was the perfect justification for intervening in other countries, and it helped create a massively powerful military-industrial complex. And for the Soviets, it was the ultimate excuse for cracking down on their own people and keeping their authoritarian system locked in place. See, having a big, scary enemy was actually the perfect tool for both sides to keep things just the way they wanted them. But, reality is almost never that black and white, is it? It probably wasn't just a simple conflict. But it probably wasn't some secret, useful arrangement either. And that leads us to our 30 and I think most nuanced lens, this idea of the superpowers as adversarial partners. Yeah, the whole idea is summed up in that one phrase, an adversarial partnership. Just think about those two words together for a second. They were total adversaries, right? Competing for influence absolutely everywhere on the globe. But at the same time, they were partners. Partners in the terrifying shared mission of not blowing up the planet. They were bound together by the one thing they both feared. And you can actually see this strange partnership develop over the years. I mean, the Cuban Missile Crisis in '62, that was the ultimate wake-up call. They stared right into the abyss, and it scared them both so much that it created this powerful, shared interest in never getting that close again. And that fear is what led directly to détente in the late '60s, this intentional period of just cooling things down. And by the 1970s, you have these two sworn enemies actually sitting at a table together, signing arms control treaties. They were basically agreeing on the rules for their own rivalry, just to make sure it didn't spiral out of control. Okay, so let's recap. We've got 3 different ways of seeing this. Lens 1, a straightforward ideological fight. Lens 2, a cynical but mutually useful system. And Lens 3, a complex, messy, adversarial partnership. So, why should we care? Why does sifting through all these old historical arguments actually matter now? It matters because of this. And this is the key takeaway for the whole thing. The way we understand the past directly shapes how we act in the present. The stories we tell ourselves about old rivalries, those become the blueprints for how we handle new ones. How we see yesterday literally determines what we do tomorrow.
And that leaves us with one last question, and this one's for you to chew on. When you look at the global conflicts happening right now, today, the tensions between different countries, between different systems, which lens are we using? Do we see a simple battle of good versus evil, a cynical game where everyone benefits? Or do we see a messy, complicated partnership between adversaries? The lens we choose, well, it matters a whole lot more than you might think.